All right, so I'm an historian, so I'm not as dynamic as people. I'll try. صباح الخير. صباح النور. Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Loubna again. I want to thank Dania and Leila and Farah and Dina. Hey, Dina. And thank you all for this incredible honor. The inspiring work that students do often resonates across so much justice work. And yours is so ferociously free that it replenishes hope for all of us working in the organizing trenches. And I would like to begin in the tradition of liberation movements everywhere by paying respect and honoring those who are not here with us. I pay homage to our martyrs. I pay homage to our prisoners and our loved ones in the camps, especially at Yarmouk, and to all of those martyrs and prisoners in movements struggling for emancipation. It's actually from those trenches and about those trenches that I want to talk about today, and to offer some context and some thoughts on what it means for students to be organizing for Palestine now. And I want to start with a little letter. On December 14, 1930, on letterhead from his home and office on 153 Clinton Street in Brooklyn, Fuad Isa Shatara wrote a letter to Albert Einstein. It began simply, "My dear sir, being one of the Palestine Arabs in the United States, who, notwithstanding their American citizenship, have not forgotten their mother country Palestine, I have followed with keen interest your statements, especially your radio address yesterday concerning Palestine and your suggestions that Jews and Arabs should come to an understanding and thus end the sad strife which has existed between them only since the announcement of the Balfour Promise." I open with this letter to introduce us all to two notions. First, it is to remind us that Palestine organizing has existed far longer than we often remember. And second, that it's far more legible than we often think. We will recognize its language, its practices, and through thinking about that experience, we can think about our own. By 1930, Fuad Shatara had in fact been organizing for nearly 13 years, since he arrived as a medical student from Yafa, but his family originally from Ramallah, as Loubna reminded me, to the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, now Columbia University Medical School, along with theology graduate student Ibrahim Rahbani from Lebanon, and writer and journalist Habib Katiba, and other organizers, workers, and students in New York's then thriving Arab community. They formed the Palestine Anti-Zionism Society in 1917, the same year as the Balfour Declaration. With this society, they ushered in the first wave of Palestine student organizing, and I'll tell you why I still call it student organizing, in the U.S., one that would last until the late 1950s and the stirrings of the Palestinian revolution among students.
Mezna, hold the microphone.
By 1921, Shatara and his comrades had expanded to the Arab community in Detroit and had changed the name of the organization to the Palestine-National League in order, in Shatara's words, to accentuate what we stood for rather than what we were against. The firm and steady prose of Shatara's letter to Einstein was in fact the first in a series of correspondences with the scientists that culminate in Einstein's famous 1948 letter on the terrorism of the Erdogan and Suri gang in the aftermath of the Deir Yassin massacre. It was also one of many thousands of letters, petitions, public statements, press releases and correspondences to newspapers, other community organizations, State Department officials, the White House and Congress, intellectuals, writers, and artists that the Palestinian National League organized to rally support for Palestinian national aspirations. And I want to stop here because I want to spend some time on the documents they produced. The first, I think, I can't say if it's the absolute first, but the first book that they came out with, booklet, 44 pages long, was called
Palestine.
You guys see the bottom? And this is, I kind of don't really understand why we wouldn't need to talk too much about Zionism after this book. It really said about as much as we need to know in 1921. And it's an extraordinary thing to see a booklet, which I actually encourage you, it's been uploaded now to the www.archives.org. You can all read it. And it's it's very dated, so you also have to remember the context in which it was written. But it's an extraordinarily concrete, thorough analysis of why Zionism must be defeated, and identified in similar ways to the fashionable ways that we tend to think we have invented now in terms of identifying the logics of Zionism, the purposes of Zionism, and the repulsion that we must and the need to confront Zionism. This booklet, which is a kind of intellectual project, was followed up in 1922 by an 8-page pamphlet that was distributed to nearly every church in the United States called Palestine's Cry for Justice, an appeal to Christian America. Remember, it's 1922. And I want to read, and it's an incredibly emotive document. I haven't had time to put it up, but I will. And it ends with these lines. In issuing this pamphlet, the Palestine-National League voices the deep sentiments of the vast majority of the people of Palestine of all classes. It asks lovers of humanity the world over, not for charity, but for simple justice. The taking from a people of their political rights and even their possessions without their consent can be justified by no moral code or legal code anywhere in the world. The Palestinians ask only to be left alone with their fellow Syrians to develop the resources of their province, which has been an integral part of Syria for over 2,000 years. They ask to be allowed to live in peace with their Palestinian Jewish neighbors and the world at large. They dread the consequence of the issues which Zionism tends to create for both Jew and Gentile. In order to avoid such a stormy future, they cry to God and humanity for justice and fair play. I can't imagine that reading this, we wouldn't be able to identify with the sentiment, the language, and the kind of principles that are embedded in it. This kind of work continued throughout the 30s. By mid-1930s, the Palestine-National League they came together and they decided to change their name to the Arab National League in order to reflect the high spirit of Arab anti-colonial popular mobilization that had developed. The Arab National League flourished in Arab communities across the U.S., along with similar formations, some more regional in character. The Arab National League strategically put its offices next to As-Sa'ib, which was one of the only Arabic language newspapers in New York. First on 85 Washington Street, then on 505 Fifth Avenue, for anybody from New York. And from its offices, the League efficiently disseminated information from and on Palestine, organized Palestine lobbying, press conferences, and public events. Long after Fuad Shatara and his crew graduated and were continuing on in their professional lives, they, alongside numerous students, organized conferences and conventions amongst Arab communities in the US. For example, in 1939, they held their fourth convention in Flint, Michigan, on a Palestinian farm owned by the Farah family. By the 1940s, however, this first period of Palestine organizing was beginning to slow down. One reason is one that we remain familiar with. The League's organizers began to burn out from the stresses of constant national work and the intense experience of the 1936-37 revolt in Palestine and the ways in which it destroyed national work had impacted them deeply. Fuad Shatara, at the heart of so much of this earliest of Palestine organizing, committed suicide by poison in his office, 153 Clinton Street, in 1942. In a letter he left to his wife, he simply wrote, "My nerves are frayed, my health undermined, and I cannot go on any longer." Another reason was that the U.S. had entered World War II, and Zionist agitation for U.S. involvement in Palestine had intensified. Part of their efforts involved intimidating Palestinian and Arab students, shutting down events they organized, blocking their access to political officials, and starting a whispering campaign that the Arab National League was involved with the Nazi propaganda machine, the World Service. As a result, it was Palestinian and Arab students who requested from the Arab National League that the most prudent course of action was to calm down and quiet down Palestine work, lest it continue to get smeared at the height of the nationalist frenzy in the US. But this dissolution of the Palestine and Arab National League did not create a vacuum for long. And by 1944, a new set of students, as well as academics and diplomats now, organized the Institute of Arab American Affairs in 1944. This was located further away from the Arab community on 120 Broadway. The Institute coordinated a monthly bulletin that was distributed to members of Congress and other notables and developed a lot more intellectual work. At this point, you might be familiar with some of the names. For example, Rashid Khalidi's father was involved in founding this, as well as Khalid Dotah, and Habib Katiba was also involved, as he was involved with Fuad Shatara earlier. Now, in this first phase, there are two lessons that I kind of want to draw out, and in our conversations, we can kind of talk a lot about other lessons. The first is that in its initial formation, Palestine organizing in the US saw no division between student and community work. It was inextricable, it was organic, it was fluid. This was all partly because most of the organizers were Arabs and Palestinians living amongst Arab and Palestinian communities here. And they helped to facilitate ties with each other, with outside groups, etc. In addition, there was a constant flux of students from the Arab world who would arrive bearing news, bearing new analysis, bearing new understandings, and they would connect to the organizing that was already in development via the Arab communities that they would live in. Another key lesson from this period is that it introduced and shows how very early on there was a presence of a kind of representational politics in our organizing, in which very often students would assume that they had the right to take on the role of speaking on behalf of, rather than bringing forward the voice of other Palestinians. This reproduces itself in the post-Oslo period in very different ways, but suffice it to say that we must always understand that class has played a role in the ways in which Palestine organizing manifests itself, both then and now. Indeed, it's precisely the strategies of speaking to power that was broken so decisively in 1948 by the Nakba, and failed strategies of Palestinian leadership before the Nakba. And second, and arguably the more profound Palestinian revolution that followed, that triggers a kind of split between the first phase and the second phase that I'd like to talk about now. So if the first phase was a kind of speaking to power sort of political organizing and practice that emerges from the community and emerges from the context of the community, what you see by the late 1950s is a complete break from those practices, where power was not, we did not speak to power, we gained power ourselves. And this second phase, which lasts from the late 1950s again to about 1990, and the periodization, we can talk about it, it's kind of boring, but if you want to ask, we can talk about it. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment, and there's a lot, you know, there was a kind of rejection of talking about this moment as extraordinary, as remarkable, as a flowering and flourishing of political work, because to do so would be to somehow cast it as, you know, as a nostalgic, you know, as being nostalgic or romantic. But let us look at it for what it was. It was a moment when Palestinians, whoever they were, entered into political work and practiced and participated in whatever way they could and in whatever way they wanted, through unions, the General Union of Palestinian Students, through popular associations, through organizing at different scales and in different sectors of wherever they were located. And you know, while there were in the United States, this represented itself by even more people in the Palestinian communities and in the Arab communities in the US, organizing themselves rather than having the students sort of take leadership on as being the organizers to which the students would kind of gain sort of the opportunities to speak because of their location within a community. It was now the communities themselves organizing within themselves. And while there were still very elite strands of student organizing throughout this period, for example, the Arab Association of University Graduates, which was, you know, developed, you know, began in the 1960s, they were now also entirely ideologically transformed. And they offered themselves very often as a kind of auxiliary or an academic auxiliary to the incredible work of the General Union of Palestinian Students. So we also have to locate this sort of pluralism that developed during this period, where there are different nodes of students organizing in different ways throughout the country. Now, you know, the history of GUPS is incredible, and it's incredibly rich, from its origins in Cairo among students at Cairo University, and the way that in which GUPS became the foundation for the emergence of our national movement. You cannot talk about the PLO and the Palestine Liberation Organization without talking about GUPS. But I want to hold off on that for a second to say that, I mean, there are two elements that mark the tone of the Palestine organizing in this period. And the two that I want to kind of focus on, that draw on a lot on what Loubna was discussing, was the way in which Palestinians took on leadership as a movement in an anti-colonial and anti-imperial movement. They took the baton from the Vietnamese resistance and the Algerian resistance, and they were now the last, or Palestinians were now the last standing, one of the last standing anti-colonial strugglers. And when they took that baton, they very much understood themselves to be part of something far greater than themselves. And this is often called the Bandung moment, when internationalism at its height and movements collaborated intensively. They exchanged material resources, both armed and otherwise. They debated and discussed political ideology amongst themselves and with each other. They mobilized collectively. And the Palestinians were training South Africans, and the PLO was organizing delegations of the American Indian movement to the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And here in the Bay, Palestinians were in regular coordination on actions of the Black Power movement. And you would often find that GUPS chapters would start by looking around to see what was missing on their campus. Is there no one doing anti-apartheid agitation? Then GUPS would do it. It would be constantly communicating with these movements. It would be connecting across continents with other students and unions and associations and popular formations, as well as the PLO, first in Jordan and in Lebanon. And so it's precisely in this phase when the justice that is demanded by Shakara and his comrades was transformed into the fullest expression of our principles, ones which guide us to this day. And these are the principles of liberation and return. I'll get back to what it means to talk about these as our principles in a moment. But, I mean, I think what's important also to talk about is that this is also the time when you saw the truly accumulated emergence of intense ally student and community formations across the U.S. Right? There's so many of them, but I want to talk about one in particular, which was one of the most significant, and it was the November 29th committee that started in the Bay in 1981, growing to over 30 chapters by the start of the first Intifada in 1987. Actually, an executive committee member who teaches here at Stanford, Hilton Obenzinger, and I salute him, and in particular his beautiful work as editor of the committee's newspaper, the Palestine Focus. Now this period then moves into a third period, which is, I swear, there's only three. And it begins sort of in 1982, and more, until 1990 and 1993, when all of this flourishing pluralist world kind of comes tumbling down. And our national politics come to their lowest ebb. And the Palestinians sort of, after the 1993 Oslo Accords, look around and say, what? Like shell-shocked. So many of the Palestinian organizers are elders who were active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We often talk to them in our community work now and want to hear from them. And there's a kind of strange, surreal feeling that we all have about what that moment, that breakage meant to them on personal levels. These people who had dedicated decades, their entire lives to Palestine, and they see it just fall apart in front of them. And for us, or most of us, I'm hardly, who were brought up under Oslo, the history of what came before it can sometimes feel a little unfamiliar and distant, as if it's happening to some other people. And while we sometimes want to learn more, many of the older Palestinians sometimes even themselves say, things don't look the same way anymore, and it all seems kind of irrelevant, or worse, it's again nostalgic and romantic. And so we look around at the remnants of the 1960s society. We look around at the shattered, the ossified national politics. And it seems difficult to conjure up that this ugliness that we see, in fact, used to be rich and flourished and was booming and was active and vibrant. And we see, it's very hard to conjure from this ugliness, that all the energy and the sacrifice and the talents of so many students and organized, how could that beautiful work turn into the polluted, unprincipled politicking and smarmy, repulsive characters of corruption? Our official politics is just simply antithetical to justice. So, we pay homage. We perhaps learn some micro detail about this or with that organizing method and strategy, and then we move on. History betrayed our cause, and our national institutions and traditions, some of us say, are beyond repair, and some of us also talk about starting again, wiping this chalkboard clean and creating a new, incorruptible epic. But I want to here not dwell on that too much. But I want to talk about what it means to say that something other than us is corruptible is corrupt, and we are not. And I want to sort of dwell a moment on how Oslo has, in a way, seeped into the very patterns of our own work, how we even conceive of ourselves. First, and these are some of the things that Loubna mentioned, is that fragmentation has been replicated in so much of our organizing, where we conceive of Palestinians as these separate entities, and we engage them in these kind of bilateral relationships. So we talk to the West Bank, we talk to Gaza, we talk to 48. We even use language like, it's after 2006, there were people called Gazans, for example. The Palestinians of 48, you call them by a date, right? Palestinians in Lebanon are from the camps, or in Syria, they're from a particular camp. In Jordan, the judgmentalism about Palestinians from Jordan is kind of astonishing. So what this has meant is that because Oslo was all about territoriality, it was all about land and taking of land, we have also begun to talk more about land and less about people. We talk less about collective politics. We talk less about, popular sovereignty. We talk less about, our self-determination is about land rather than about us as a people. We also sometimes perpetuate some of the black legends or some of the kinds of tales that get repeated about the revolution. So, for example, we often talk about the inside leadership and the outside leadership. And we often position ourselves according to who we've determined was less corrupt. Failing often to understand context and substituting judgment for it. But one of the most important shifts that we've seen are about two key issues. One is solidarity, and the other one is, I don't know if people use this word, but I like to use it, solutionism. And I want to talk about those for a moment. The first, in terms of solidarity, I think Loubna's kind of addressed it, and I completely agree with you, which is this idea that very often Palestinians, even in student organizing, no longer say, as Qato did in 1930, as a Palestinian, I think this. They say, as students, we are in solidarity with Palestinians, even if they themselves are Palestinian. We are now Palestinians who are in solidarity with ourselves. And the other issue is that the Palestinian, because of the shattered Palestinian body politic, we now live in a world where the movement consists of not one, but many movements. And they're all constellations, and they're all orbiting around the political work and thoughts and ideas of particular platforms or particular individuals. All of this unfettered from any sense of national accountability, outside completely of any national structures. And this solutionism has kind of offered up in the last at least 10 years endlessly compelling solutions that emerge out of conversations and thinkings that aren't rooted in the principle of grassroots democratic mobilization or collective deliberation within an open, plural space, which can assure that all are heard, all voices are equal, and privilege is only incurred to those whose sacrifices and needs warranted. In that context, exclusion and denunciation begin to seep in. Radical, and the notion of who is radical, begins to mask the kind of idea that we must all agree in order for us to move forward. But unity is not about agreeing. Unity is about first coming together. And so this is, when I talk about the principle of liberation and return, what am I trying to say? What am I trying to have us think a little bit about? The first is that return, in the first instance, is a return to our people. It is a return to each other. It is not necessarily, this is the beginning. This is the first principle of any organizing work in the liberation movement, that we all must come together. And as we continue the kind of campaigning, the incredible BDS work, the incredible divestment work on campuses, we have to think of ourselves as students who have a role in terms of serving a national movement. And what can that role be? And this is something that we have to have a conversation about. I'm a little skeeved out by giving, again, solutions. But I think one of the most important things is to kind of ask these questions. Because it's very often these questions that can kind of unleash some of the things that get hidden by the constant push to achieve more and more tactical victories. And it's also, the problem is, in a sense, that this kind of question of what does it mean to serve our people, what does it mean to be a Palestinian student, is often the result of one central problem. That most of our activist spaces, or many of them, often leave out a very important question. And that is, especially when it is kind of a space that is very concerned with solutions. And that is, what does everyone else think? We very rarely ask that question. And in fact, it is from that question that any solution will emerge. And it's not the other way around. We do not make solutions and then tell people this is what you must think. And what makes this particularly tragic, the lack of this question about what do others think, what does everyone else think, is that it excludes those Palestinians who are already ghosts and privileges those who have more platforms than they could ever use. At Yarmouk, for example, the capital of the Qato, the largest Palestinian refugee camp, is being destroyed. Before it, nothing better. Did we turn to those people? Or the nearly 400,000 Palestinians without papers in the Gulf? Or the 70,000 Palestinians in Egypt? The 8,000 in Yemen? Or the 30,000 Palestinians from Iraq now scattered all over the world? Did we ask them what they think of the solutions that we have conquered? We have conjured? We seem to circulate with such ferocious speed, touting these solutions as the next new thing, the thing, it is it. This is how we will liberate Palestine. Without sitting down and saying, well, who is missing from this conversation? Who is not here? And I mean, there's also one other element of this that is kind of interesting for me, is that these kinds of practices and the ways we speak about national work as solution work, is that we tend to sort of think that our imaginative capacities have to be about, what it will look like when we are liberated. There's very rarely opportunities to talk about and use and unleash that imagination on the question of how do we get there? What is the organizing, mobilizing, heavy lifting that we must do to bring our people together? What kinds of ways can we do that? The ways in which we need the moment, we need to pause for a moment, just a moment in this rush, and ask ourselves, what is the path? We've identified it, the principle is there. How do we get there? Step by step. And how do we bring, first and foremost, how do we bring all our people together to start asking that question, not the other way around? And there is a lot of talk amongst Palestinians in the US and connecting abroad, and PYM is central to that conversation about what it means to rebuild structures, what it means to rebuild national institutions, what it means to retrieve and recapture the public sphere that we crafted ourselves from emptiness, where we crafted ourselves from kind of, the intrigue and the collaboration and the corruption that was before it. And how do we seize it? Why do we need to seize it? Why can we not ignore history? Because essentially it is ours. Just as Palestine is ours, our movement is ours. Our national institutions are ours. And it is only when we try to bring everyone together to think about and craft ways in which we can retrieve those national institutions can we really kind of think and talk about the path to return and liberation. And here too, on solidarity, and we can talk about the bifurcation that I've made, has to ask itself also a few questions. One is how can we help the Palestinian body politic to flourish? Solidarity has very clear instructions on tactical campaigns that it can do. Our solidarity movement is amazing. But the one question that is left lacking is, what can they do to bring Palestinians back to the core of their own movement? I do want to end with that because I think that, us as students, as Palestinians in the United States that organize in communities, we kind of need to decide what our task is. And I think, and I want to argue and make the case, that our task right now is to bring our people together and to assert our collective rights. And we do that first and foremost by looking for our people. We don't even know where they are. We need to find them. And that is our first principle. And it's from there, it's only from there, that our paths must always begin and will begin. Because at every organizing level, if we do not look around and ask, who is not here? Who are the working class Palestinian students who are not here? Who are the Palestinian youth who do not go to university? Why are they not here? Where are the kids who cannot, who are undocumented, Palestinians who are undocumented in this country? Why are they not in this room? Why do they not have a voice? Why are they not in this conversation? Why are they not in political development workshops? These are the kinds of questions. This is the kind of ways we search out our own community. And from that, we will no longer be in solidarity with ourselves. We'll be free together. And that's where we begin to walk the path of liberation and return. Thank you.